Welcome to Burning Platforms. I'm Peter Lewis and this is your weekly fix of the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita. This week we're going to dive deep into the digital duty of care with our special guest, the co-founder of the Tech Policy Design Institute, Zoe Hawkins. But first, let's dig into the good, the bad and the ugly from the week that was with our panellists. Digital Rights Watch Chair and all-round tech warrior, Lizzie O'Shea. Hey, Lizzie.
Hi, Peter.
And the tech bro with a soul, Health Engine CEO, Dan Stinton. Hi, Dan.
I don't recall starting off on that moniker, by the way, but hi, Peter.
It's just fitting, though. Like, it is working. It's better than anything else I've tried over the last 4 or 5 years. Anyway, look, Lizzie, let's start with a story I find incredibly sad. Companies with names like Waffle, Lule and Clad are paying pennies to get people to strap a camera on their head and film the most mundane aspects of their life in order to train the robots. What do we know?
Yeah, this is an interesting few stories that have come out in the last couple of weeks from Bloomberg, from Wired, excuse me, about the experience of people being paid to film themselves doing everyday tasks. And the idea is that that footage is then going to be used as raw data that goes into robotics training. So physical AI, how we might be able to train robots, for example, as opposed to large language models, they do suffer from, according to the industry, a data deficit, because how you train them to do everyday tasks is quite difficult. You don't have the whole of the internet to scrape and train your large language model on, as so many of the big AI companies have done. So instead, what is going on is in places like India, where labour is still very cheap, and also a lot of tasks that might be automated in other parts of the world are still being done manually. Workers are being paid a little bit extra on top of their normal salaries to strap a iPhone to their head, essentially, and film the work that they do. So everything from manufacturing shoes and lacing them up to picking plastic and recycling, for the purposes of sorting it out into different categories. And the idea is that this would perform a big data set. It sort of reminded me of some of the stories from Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI, where they talk about outsourcing data cleaning and labeling to places of economic crisis, and that there's a large number of companies that were doing that to recruit people to do that work, which is otherwise quite mundane, and pay them very little for it. And this looks kind of similar. I think it is interesting to think about this industry as a subset of the AI industry. It's predicted to be one of the biggest growth areas in relation to AI. So it could reach 7 trillion as a market by 2050. And what is interesting is now, I'm now getting into this. There's a lot of videos, there's a whole genre of videos of robots doing things that look pretty impressive and then crashing and burning. Or there's a whole genre of videos of robots accidentally kicking kids in the face when they're doing some display activity, which I find darkly amusing, but it is bad, right? And so you can see this industry's got a problem. They need a huge amount of data. They need it to be cleaned and labeled and things like that. So there's a whole process now evolving that is quite exploitative. And large language models have managed to do this in exploitative ways as well. The question is, it's 10 years now where this data will be collected before most of this work will be ultimately automated, is the thinking.
So, Dan, as the entrepreneur in the room, at least it is not surveillance creating, there is a transaction here. It might be meager, it might be exploitative, but isn't all labour. Is there a justification as if this is the way data is going to be collected, then getting people to strap iPhones on their heads is the most ethical way of doing so?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would describe it as a justification. I mean, you're paying people slightly more money to make their jobs redundant, right? I mean, that's the reality of this, So
and that's different to every other job.
Well, I think it is, right?
Teams and they're surveilling you without you knowing it.
Well, there's two thoughts I had about this story. So the first one is, you're basically now, because as Lizzie mentioned, all of the models have effectively sucked up all of the information on the internet and most of the books and everything else besides. The only way that you're really going to get the next sort of quantum leap in capability is if you start getting more data, and that's typically going to come from more courting and more surveillance, right? So I think this is just another example of that. But, we're going to end up in a circumstance where, there's been lots of exploitative problems with the sweatshops of China and everywhere else as those countries have developed. But you look at China now and it's become an industrial powerhouse. And that's not going to be possible, I think, or at least not to the same extent for countries like India and Bangladesh and the like. And I think that's a real problem. And the part of this which sort of brings it home to me is I've got a real example from my own company of something quite similar to this, but which is probably not getting as much of, or probably isn't as shocking as what some of these images are. And that is, for the last 3 years, I've been arguing with my CTO about whether we should look to set up an offshore team based in India to be able to do some of the routine coding work and be able to build our products faster. And he's been telling me all the reasons why that was a bad idea, and probably right. But we've stopped having that conversation now, because there's just no reason to be outsourcing that coding development to India now, because AI effectively makes that. Yeah, and so that's the way. I mean, that's the future of this as well, right? Like you no longer need to go to a country like India or anywhere else in order to take advantage of the cheaper labour in order to build products, and that's going to become the case of pretty much every other industry that outsources to India and everywhere else in the world.
Lizzie, I also noticed that a number of the founders of these iPhone on your head startups were young, part of that Y Combinator network that was Sam Altman's original vehicle. Like, I think there is a sense in which that kind of model of technology through venture startup creates its own bizarre realities, and maybe this is one of those.
Yeah, Y Combinator is kind of notorious for being an incubator for startups that really, if you get admitted into it, is like you've got a future there. You'll get VC funding for your idea, even probably if it's not a very good one. But what I would say is, I think this is the full pipeline of the AI. People think about this technology as frictionless or godlike, or also completely contained in computers or data centers, when in fact there is this huge element of the supply chain which involves, very poorly paid labor to do the work that makes the technology look like magic. And so I think this is an important reminder. Like, there was a whole period in which the work of content moderators came to the fore during earlier days of social media, and also, of course, data categorization for large language models. And this is now, for robotics, I think, an interesting examination that we have to pay attention to. We need to understand the full pipeline of this supply chain to fully appreciate the social and environmental impacts of this tech, and assuming that it's just the pointy end where the models are created or the robotics are implemented is a mistake. So I think this reporting and this kind of storytelling is pretty important.
Dan, another thing that's happening this week, I think we're recording Tuesday night, but tomorrow the federal government's convening National Cabinet to nut out some of the rules for data centres. In preparation last week, Minister Andrew Charlton laid out his roadmap in a speech to the Crawford School of Public Policy. You've had a look at it and you're a little bit excited.
Yeah, I think he nails it with this speech. I think that what he is outlining for Australia is pretty sensible, right? So look, the central argument of his speech was that Australia risks becoming effectively a permanent importer of intelligence, if you like. So, we're already spending about $5 to $8 billion a year on AI, apparently. Most of that's flowing overseas, and Charlton thinks that could grow to about 20 to 40 billion annually within a decade. So the problem is that while Australia is attracting more than like 150 billion of data centre investment, the energy and the data centres, they represent only a small part of AI's value. And he laid this out, Charlton laid this really in a really compelling way. And he basically said that for every dollar that's invested in a data centre, 5 cents of that goes to electricity, 10 cents of it goes to data center infrastructure, about 35 to 45 cents goes to the GPUs and the servers and the networking and all of that. And then about half, so 40 to 50% goes to the models, engineers, software, training and IP. And effectively, almost all of that is going offshore. Once the data center is built, there's very little benefit for Australia. So Charlton's solution is not to build an Australian version of ChatGPT, thankfully, but he wants to leverage our advantages in energy and data centers to effectively give Australian researchers and companies access to compute, and then to build specialised Australian AI models and applications on top of sort of increasingly capable open weight models, which I think is exactly what Australia should be doing.
Gee, it's a heavy lift though, isn't it, Lizzie? Because that basically the strategy is to build lots of data centers, the idea of compute as leverage so that if you can control the compute, you can control the outcome, and then you can start moving up the value chain. But I know you were at community meetings last week in suburban Melbourne where people are starting to get the pushback on the data centers. There's also been stats this week out on the energy usage. So it's not as simple as just wishing this into existence, is it?
Yeah, well, it does seem to all depend on us understanding that infrastructure build as being what we have to leverage value from the whole industry. And I don't know that we've got the match with what communities feel who have to experience this. I keep returning to that question that AOC asked in one of those community meetings, who wants a data centre next to their home? And, I was out in West Footscray and there's this huge NextDC data centre. People are walking their children to kindergarten and go past it. It's in the middle of a highly urban environment. And the community is really dark about it, and they feel that the planning rules have not been properly followed. There's a backup set of power generation that involves diesel generators if it goes down because it has to be up all 24 hours a day. There's a disconnect here, I think, with the idea that there's a real promise if we can leverage that capacity. I mean, I do wonder whether that leap is truly possible. So I'm interested to hear Zoe's take as well. Can we actually turn our infrastructure, even if we fully lean into the infrastructure commitment, turn that into some other kind of a competitive advantage at other layers? But I do think it's going to involve quite a bit of work with local communities to get them on board with that infrastructure bill, because I feel like there's a growing disconnect.
Yeah,
anyway,
well, let us bring Zoe in. Everyone wants Zoe, and you guys at Tip, you've done some really interesting work trying to break down not so much the elements of sovereignty, but you call it agency. So do you want to quickly sort of explain how you're approaching these sorts of issues?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, absolutely. It's we call it agency, but actually there's a real strong through line with what Minister Charlton was saying in that speech as well, actually shifting the conversation to value, because the agency framing that we think about for this is actually part of it is how do you steer the outcomes? How does Australia or any other country shape the trajectory of where this is going? I think sometimes we talk about it like it's inevitable that this is sort of happening to us. So the first step is that sense of steering. But the second part in how we think about agency is capturing value, because I think sometimes the AI sovereignty conversation can feel quite defensive, and it's often about what can you control, what do you have in your wheelhouse. So I think part of it is remembering that big picture, how do you zoom out and then say, okay, Australia has leverage in some of those areas, not all, but we actually need to know which ones they are. I'm happy to talk more about that. But then we can't prioritize them all. Australia has to pick its areas of competitive advantage. And having that big picture helps you do that.
This is the thing, isn't it, Dan, that Andrew Charlton has got a clearly articulated vision that he believes is in the national interest and you find quite compelling. At the same time, we have communities preparing to push back really hard against the infrastructure that's needed to get there. That is the actual, both the leverage point for the community, but the fundamental challenge for the government, isn't it?
It is, but I think Australia is doing centres better than most of the world. I think that the standards that we have and the regulation that we have is there for a reason, and the government's not watering that down, right? It's maintaining that stance. I mean, what is kind of frustrating about this, right, is that it's become every conversation about AI becomes a conversation about the data centres. And what Andrew Charlton was actually saying was data centres were a component of that, but it was more, hey, let's make sure that Australia is actually building our own models or building on top of our own open weight models for Australia's interests, and not going so far as building a frontier model to compete with ChatGPT and Claude. But, let's take an open weight model we might have talked about once or twice on the show before and, give it access to Australian healthcare data, for example, and use that for Australia's interests. Because what Australia has that is unique to us is we have a whole bunch of data which none of the models have access to. And if Australia is intentional about the use of that data, then we can build our own models for our own ends. And provided there isn't this kind of I think slightly fanciful idea of takeoff where we're going to get to AGI and effectively one model is going to rule the world, then I think we're going to be in a good position for Australia to take advantage of that. So I think it's a really sensible and pragmatic approach from Charlton, and that's why I think it's good to have his voice in Canberra.
So I might round out the news with what I think is a really interesting good news story. I've become strangely optimistic over the last few months that there are a few bits of cultural pushback going on. This one involves ARIA changing the way the music charts are put together to limit the use of AI in production. Our friend Cam Wilson is reporting that this is not an outright ban, but the new framework would exclude music with lead vocals or key instrumentals that were AI generated. The test is a little bit like the Proudly Human one for writers, which is substantially human made. So it might allow for synth and drum machines and sampling, but the lines are being drawn, so it would definitely capture, our favourite AI band, Lizzie Velvet. It's part of a global push to defend the integrity of the charts, and it comes after an Australian DJ, Joss Fawaz, cover of Madonna's Like a Prayer reached number 4 on the ARIA charts in July, and that would have crossed those lines. So, Dan, I know this is an issue close to your heart as well, but it also seems a bit of self-preservation as the whole industry risks being drowned in slop, particularly the streamers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really encouraged by this. This is quite an optimistic burning platform, isn't it? I'm really encouraged by
apart from the cameras on the head, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, apart from that, yes, sure. Look, I think what we're starting to see now, right, is that there's a real growing backlash against the use of AI in music, and I think this is probably going to extend across sort of all culture in time. It started with Bandcamp banning AI music on their platform. Camp was leading the fight. And then we've had Spotify also announced a couple of weeks ago that they were going to label AI music, which is at least a step in the right direction, and we're no longer going to recommend it as part of their algorithms. And then this, right? And this also follows, an announcement from the record companies, which took place a couple of weeks ago. I think 11 record companies in total, the major ones, Universal and Sony and the like, but also a lot of independent ones, where basically they came out and said that they were opposed to AI music. Now, it's probably self-serving because they've got this big catalogue of works which they want to protect. But nonetheless, I think, people hate this stuff. People hate this stuff, or enough people hate it that there's a norm being established that AI music is shit and should not be tolerated. And I think this is only growing.
Lizzie, ARIA is also leading the charge on copyright breaches, so it's interesting that they're broadening their focus away from just the legalities to now the way the market's operating.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other interesting aspect of the music industry is there's a lot of people who maybe make music that's close to their heart, that might be ultimately a contender for something like an ARIA award, but then they also make money producing music that goes in the background of various things. And that second market, of like music for podcasts, music for hold, music for whatever, is just evaporating. And so there's this... I find these things heartening as well, but there's this aspect of the industry now that means it's harder for people to have a meaningful, well-paying job in the sector while also pursuing their kind of passion projects as part of that. And I do wonder how you address that. Like, you probably need to do both, right? You need to find ways to preserve cultural recognition of the artifact and then also sustainable incomes for people. Maybe it is through a model of copyright rights enforcement, rights revenue and the like. And so it really probably has to be both. So, I mean, I'm heartened by it, but I just think there's some economic realities in that industry that are going to be difficult to reverse. And there'll be pretty serious questions to ask if some of these copyright bodies don't find ways to also give people access to a meaningful income to participate in the industry. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's almost like a third leverage point. So we're talking before about the vision for Australian AI from the minister. You've got communities pushing back on data centres. You've got creators pushing back on culture. This negotiation is going on in real time. But I feel... if I look at where I was 6 months ago, I thought there was an assumption the whole thing would roll over us, and I just feel a little bit more optimistic at this stage. So maybe that's why we're a little bit sunnier at this stage. That's good. So let's go to our special guest. Zoe Hawkins is, as we said at the outset, the co-founder of the Tech Policy Design Institute. Zoe also worked in government for Paul Fletcher when he was Communications Minister, which is a really interesting sort of background to bring to the convo, Zoe. So thanks for joining us. Do you want to just sort of give us a little bit of an overview of who Tipti is and what you do.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to be here with you. Tech Policy Design Institute, we are an independent think tank. We're based in Canberra, and really we exist to be the independent expert conveners of industry, government, civil society, and research to actually help those stakeholder groups work together and problem solve to do tech policy better, which I know is a lot of what you guys talk about on this show. So it's great to be joining you.
Yeah, and having come out of government, I'm interested in the degree to which the sort of work you're trying to do, which is really bring stakeholders together, design policy, is filling a gap that you noticed when you were inside.
Yeah, I think it's something that, so Johanna Weaver and myself, the co-founders, share an experience of having been in government. And really, I think the main thing that we both took from that, first of all, is it's really hard to do good policy in this space. So I think the first thing for us is really a sense of, I guess, sympathy for people in government. I think it's easy to sort of criticize from the outside, but it is a challenging space. One, because it moves so quickly, but particularly when it comes to online safety and those sort of very prominent, people-focused harms, because everybody has an opinion on that, and there's a lot of politics that comes into it. But both Johanna and myself really felt government needs support on this. There was a bit of a gap there, I suppose, one for the actual research and independent policy advice itself. But as you've mentioned, Pete, it's also actually, there's such a polarized stakeholder, sort of entrenched, hot debate in this space. And sort of what we see as an opportunity in our role is to build bridges between those groups. It doesn't mean everyone's going to agree, but how can we build that common ground so that we can actually move forward with some of these issues, because they're really important.
Yeah, and I got a chance to see you guys in action a couple of weeks ago when you put on a day's workshop to do some of this work around the digital duty of care, and I really appreciated both getting a sense of the scope of the work, and you had the author of the report that's prompted this digital duty of care, Delia Rickard, there as well, but you had representatives from government, the industry, civil society, and it was interesting to see people nutting out the problem. So I do want to go a bit deeper into it and also get your take on where it's going from here. But firstly, for listeners, do you want to just explain what the digital duty of care is and where it's come from and how it might work?
Yeah. This is certainly not Australia's first online safety policy rodeo. So for listeners, if you don't know, I think Australia has sort of prided itself on being a bit of a first mover in the online safety space, for better or worse, depending on who you are,
indeed.
What you think about that. But fair to say that they've done a lot of ambitious reforms. So, I mean, this is a 10-year journey, really. It's been 10 years that Australia's had an independent online safety regulator, one of the first, I think the first in the world, actually. And I suppose the digital duty of care is like a maturing of that story. I think the biggest difference for people to think about is, up until now, Australia's online safety laws have really looked at individual pieces of content, really like takedown notices and cleaning up harms after they happen. And this change with the digital duty of care is really saying, how do we get in front of these harms? How do we actually put the responsibility away from users to dodge the harms, but actually say the responsibility sits with these services to prevent foreseeable harms from happening on their platform? So I think that's a pretty big mind shift in, where does the burden of responsibility sit and where in the sort of process of harm is government intervening? And the digital duty of care will say big tech has to prevent the harm.
And what I like about it intuitively is it's a little bit like we've banged on a bit about OH&S laws in the past and how they've been quite transformative in a whole lot of different ways of improving safety in the workplace. And that idea of a duty of care to take reasonable steps to deal with foreseeable risk just creates, it means you're not actually regulating specifics, you're creating expectations and then you enforce off the harm based on the breach of those expectations. Is that a fair summary?
That's right. And two things to say to that. One, it just proves this isn't a new idea. This isn't reinventing the wheel in terms of a concept. But the other benefit of, as you say, making it more overarching and at a principles level that responsibility sits with platforms is it helps us avoid, one, the whack-a-mole of harm has occurred. Okay, now we have to respond to it. But it also recognizes that these things change really quickly.
the harms that we're talking about now, we might not have even been thinking about 6 months ago. And so actually it avoids us having to itemize, this is exactly the harm that you have to prevent, because that's just going to change. We'll be back in Parliament every 6 months trying to keep the laws up to date. So the other benefit of this approach is actually sort of future-proofing the law.
Zoe, this feels like a digital duty of care feels like it is particularly well suited to AI and the model makers themselves with what they're releasing. I mean, the issue is because it is such a general purpose technology, trying to think about what all those harms could be is probably an impossible problem. But with sufficient care, I mean, at least you can mitigate a lot of them.
But
what's your take on that? Do you think that one, do you think that this has a digital duty of care has a central role to play? I'm assuming you do, but please tell us more about it. And two, do you think that the industry itself is embracing this at a high enough level?
Well, Dan, I would say that if the reaction is, oh, if I have to be held accountable for the harms that are going to come from the service, then it's impossible. Like, that's too hard. Well, I think that tells you a lot, right? So I agree with you that it's difficult, and I'm not diminishing the challenge of that in a space. And it's not just the speed of change, right? But it's also, I think it's a narrative you hear a lot around AI, particularly as it relates to sort of, the black box of the algorithm. And I think that unknowableness, and it did come up a little bit, Pete, in some of our discussions. Somebody was making the point, is it foreseeable or is it like preventable? Like these kinds of distinctions that people were trying to make from a technical perspective, that really grappling with the point of a lot of the time you hear that people really don't know what these models are going to do. I personally think that in and of itself is a signal that this is really important. So to me, that makes it more important, not less, that we actually place that liability somewhere.
One of my concerns, Zoe, though, I suppose, is that like the devil's going to be in the detail. I think with a policy like this, how do you map out what's the expectation with a digital duty of care, like foreseeable or knowable, whatever. But also, the current ambition of the government is very significant, which is not something I'm necessarily opposed to, but it does apply to like
that seems on brand for you. Ambitious reform.
But like every layer of the stack, for example, is going to be captured by this, and that does require, I think, quite a bit of nuance. Is where I was going, because people who provide some of the more infrastructure-like layers aren't keen on doing content moderation work, right? That is usually reserved for the more semantic layers of the web, right? So it's not that I criticize the ambition, but I just do think that there's got to be some real care, I think, taken to make sure it's tailored to the role that you might play as a entity in offering a service on the internet. And there may be some traps and trips that we've seen abroad that we don't want to replicate. I mean, is that something you think that the government's open to doing?
I couldn't agree. So essentially, proportionality, I feel, is sort of part of what you're getting to, which is the role that a different service might play in that full tech stack. Absolutely should play a part in determining what is a reasonable role for them to play in the duty of care obligation. The comment I'd make is one of the observations that I had from the dialogue is that I think that it's not as broadly understood as it could be, the breadth of services that are already in scope under the Online Safety Act has been in place for 5 years. I know that you know that, but it's actually every single service, everything from the infrastructure and the devices, internet service providers, hosting services, they're all captured under the existing Online Safety Act. So I think the premise of everybody has a role to play was already quite a controversial and provocative position that the 2021 law has taken. So I think and so in some ways, the development of all of the online safety codes that sit on, so there's 8 categories that the Online Safety Act breaks it down into, and all of them have had codes and standards developed over the last 5 years. It's a big piece of work that eSafety has run with overseen industry's development of. So I feel that there has almost been a very big collective let's say negotiation and learning as to what is that graduated responsibility across the entire tech stack, because they kind of had to prosecute those arguments in what their code obligations should be. So there is a base. I say that just to emphasize there's a basis of work and knowledge that already sits here that we should try and leverage off. And it's one of the things that we discussed at the dialogue is how do you keep the lessons and the value of the work that's already been done, whilst recognizing that some of it now has been outpaced and needs to be replaced.
Can I check how well I was listening at that thing? So I walked away saying there were 3 points of friction, really. One is whether the duty of care will apply only to kids or to everyone. I think the second one was whether there would be specific harms outlined, or which is kind of the British model, or a more general duty, which is more the European model. And then the third one, which is probably the hardest, is how the hell are you going to enforce any penalties? Is that kind of... And the other thing that struck me, Zoe, was the legislation's being drafted and people are still thinking through pretty, threshold issues.
Which just as a throwback comment, I think one of the I had when you prompted me about, my time in Parliament, this idea of the politics of online safety, there's this real tension between and people expect you to consult and to get it right if you're in government, but at the same time they expect that answer very quickly, and there's a lot of pressure to do more, and there is this sense of a drumbeat even if that's not true. And so I think there is a bit of a tension sometimes about how quickly to move versus how carefully to make those decisions, but I think it is in terms of common ground and areas of friction, as you put it, I personally think there was actually quite more common ground on the premise of a digital duty of care in that room than I actually expected. Now you might say, okay, but that's because it's a selective group, a self-selecting group of people who have decided to spend a day talking about the digital duty of care. They're probably already slightly invested.
Unless they were representing people who have their headquarters in Silicon Valley, where they just sat quietly. So I'm going to say to the listeners, because they may not realise that, so those people were there, those companies were represented, and so it actually was kind of a big deal that was a general consensus that was there, that the premise of moving to proactive prevention of harms, actually also the fact that there was Peter, I don't know if you remember this, but there was quite strong consensus around the very broad church, Lizzie, to your point about actually capturing a very broad range of what we consider to be online services. That was quite universal. So I agree with you on the points of friction. Let's unpack in a minute more the kids versus adults one, because I think it's really interesting. The other one that I'd add to the list, though, was this question around, harms that sit below a threshold, but that can be viewed as cumulative, which I found kind of interesting. So this idea that a particular type of content, and it was really being raised in the context of misogyny, for example, because we had teachers' consent there, we had Movember, and that's obviously a big part of the social conversation at the moment. To what extent does the duty grapple with how those harms accumulate over time as opposed to being harmful in one instance? And that's I think that's as you say, one of the big questions remaining as to how the duty is designed.
It's not that I don't think this is a policy that should be pursued, but I think there is sometimes a tendency within industry as well to say that it needs to include everything, and then it becomes all too hard. And so I think there's a real question about how you neutralise that kind of thinking. I'm interested to also see how the Children's Online Privacy Code is received. For example, that's due to be implemented at the end of the year, and it'll be interesting to see whether that gets any backlash, and that will then inform some of the work around a digital duty of care. The only other thing I just wanted to ask you about those, Zoe, is I don't know, I'm obsessed with this because I'm a litigation lawyer, but one of the things I think that is sometimes undercooked in policy making or regulation of tech is that courts are kind of underutilised, and there's this big emphasis on regulators being the sole repository of enforcement in circumstances where we know that just isn't necessarily effective in the way that it needs to be. And I wondered what you thought about how courts in other parts of the world are much more active in giving finding regulation that allows courts to be involved in these processes through, private public litigation, civil society litigation, other kinds of rulemaking or boundary setting around what the duty could be. Whether that's something that Australia should pursue, or whether I'm just a hammer and everything looks like a nail.
You just love being in court, Lizzie, and that's I know you do.
I love suing.
You're trying to angle for some business in there.
Well, it doesn't. You've got a lower risk of having a tariff slapped on you by the White House. If you're
isn't
bringing
this what the duty of care does? like, isn't that like it's not regulating, it is saying that there will be a course of action if something goes wrong and you can't show that you've met
Yeah, but
your
that does
standard.
require, there's got to be some way in which you enforce that. And doing that as a regulator only activity, I think, is potentially a oversight. And as in, I mean, I think it's a problem because you don't give enforcement a proper chance. It's like nice rules are great, but enforcement is a big challenge. And we've seen that with safety, right? Like, to varying degrees of success, you probably can't rely on regulators alone to do this work for a variety of good reasons, you know? So anyway, I don't know.
More
Yeah.
in regards, so first in two ways, less so in the role of the courts, but more if these powers are given to e-safety, then it's actually also matching the capability in basic terms. In the first case, are they funded to do that well? You can't sort of provide this, new power or this new sort of stick that they can use if they don't have the capacity to monitor and enforce, as you say. The point, though, that I thought came up that is akin to what you're saying, which is there's a role beyond the regulator. What's the role of civil society? What's the role of, in fact, researchers? And that came up quite a lot in regards to the transparency point. Access.
Yeah, access. That was the other big piece, wasn't it? Yeah. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so there was a big
Lizzie?
Conversation around, and looking at the EU model, particularly under the DSA, around, researcher access to the data that sits behind how these platforms work, and the idea that there's a monitoring, scrutinizing, accountability function that can be played by civil society and researchers, right? And there's benefits to that one, which is it recognises the role of the community, but as you say, it also brings other people into the picture in terms of the pressure and the observability that's going on. So that was certainly, there was a lot of, I mean, Pete, I'd interested in your reflection, but I think there was quite a lot of support around the importance of that, and it was more of a case of the mechanics, I feel, more than the pressure.
Yeah. I reckon there was also, to Lizzie's point before of the perfect being the enemy of the good, people were really aware that it's going to be pretty hard, and particularly aware that you can't turn this into like get lured into this sense of freedom of speech culture wars around this. So I think, one of the bits that I walked away, and I think we had a discussion about this at the end, was we got to be really sort of hard-headed on what is politically feasible to get through. And I know there were a few elected reps from your network there as well who were very much on that as well.
Well, it goes to it goes to Lizzie's point about this is fragile, which I think is right. It's both very important, complicated, in flight, so to speak, but also highly susceptible to the politics of this. I mean, I feel that online safety populism swings both ways. Like, there's two trenches that could fall into. One, it falls victim to, and the baggage of the mis and disinformation bill was like clearly in the room. The idea of you stray too far into adult behavior online and you really fall foul of the free speech kind of argument or the proponents of that, or you go the other way and it can become very drumbeaty. You've got to take action. You've got to do it now. Protect the kids narrative, which is super important, but that's how you get something as quick as the age restrictions, right? So I feel like there's sort of two guardrails that you're sort of bowling down the middle of the lane, trying to keep a really important reform from being politicized one way or another. So I think it was good to see a bit of a sense of commitment amongst the group that actually protecting this reform from that was quite important.
Dan's return to earth. I'm interested in your reflections on, the tech sector of which you are a part, are naturally. No, I'm talking to Dan here. Dan is part of the tech sector because he is a tech bro, ergo tech sector, with a heart, albeit, and a soul, and also bandwidth that is now working. So it's the full package. But I don't know how much of that you caught, Dan, but for an employer, having another layer of obligation, and I know that it could extend beyond the actual platforms to companies that are deploying tech. Will that be having guidelines in place that says, okay, that's going to be the reasonable standard of how I should be using different sorts of technology? Is that a help or a hindrance?
I think it's a help provided everybody does it, right? I mean, it's a slightly different scenario for us because not only Do we have a soul? Although I probably should stop referencing that that bad description. But we work in healthcare, right? So it's a highly regulated. It's a highly regulated industry. You're dealing with very sensitive data, sensitive information with a capital S and I, and as a consequence of that, pretty much every company that we deal with takes those responsibilities incredibly seriously because the stakes are so high. If you don't take them seriously, then people's health is at risk, right? And it's directly attributable to the services that we're all building, right? So, I think it's sort of an understood phenomenon. What I would love to see, by the way, is when the harm is not so obvious, I'd love to see companies in other industries still take those responsibilities seriously. And I think that's the gap, right? Is that, it's easy in healthcare in a sense because everybody understands the stakes. It's much less easy in other industries where you've got tech companies that are, doing a whole bunch of things and not really trying very hard.
Can I pick up on this, Dan? Because I think it was another theme that came through in our design dialogue that Lizzie, I think you'd be very happy about, which is how can we use policy to make competing on safety commercially attractive. So really looking at the point about fundamentally, if this is a competition between different companies, how do we make the incentive structure that sits in the market actually push companies towards doing this? Because recognizing that they are, profit-seeking organizations, how do we design the scenario around them so that actually gets them to pursue that as a point of competitive advantage? And that was, I know, a point that you have raised before, which is that ultimately the very business model of, keeping users engaged with the recommender algorithms, it's all geared toward that being their rational choice as a motivation. So how do we intervene in that business model?
I think that's an interesting observation because as far as I can tell, also the monetization of content is largely excluded from the scope of the digital duty of care, which I think is an interesting omission. And I wonder whether there's scope to get it in because, there's a few documented examples around this. There was the stabbing, I think, in Bondi Junction, where before it was revealed who the offender might have been, there was content suggesting the person was Jewish, suggesting they were Muslim, it was, and this is pre the Bondi massacre, right? So it's in this heightened period of political tension. The monetization pool for content is interesting in that it does have a huge impact on the information ecosystem, but it's kind of excluded as a kind of product or service that they're allowed to kind of work on. And, that's the next kind of stage of that.
Interesting. The thing that I found encouraging, though, is there seems to be clarity that service and product design is in scope. So it's not just you let bad content disseminate on your platform and we're sucked back into Section 230 kind of debates. It's actually saying you have designed a product that caused harm, that is, addictive, that is designed to, by design, amplifies outrageous or engaging and sort of harmful content, for example. Those system and product design decisions are in scope of the duty.
So I want to put you back into the communication minister's office in a different universe where there wasn't a change of government, but this policy is moving along. What do you think needs to happen politically for a window to open here? And what sort of advice would you be giving your minister on how broad or narrow to go if your job was to land the legislation?
It's not an easy job, is the first thing that I'd say. I think I'd feel pretty stressed. But I think it's having more of the types of conversations that we had the other day, because part of this is recognizing what is that common ground that has that critical mass of support, working out what those more fringe issues are where you're going to lose people. And then I think it's laying the groundwork. I mean, as you know, there were all sides of politics represented in those parliamentarians. And I do think there was quite an aha moment collectively when the discussion turned to the pragmatism and you were talking about political feasibility, and everyone went, to Lizzie's point, perfect being the enemy of the good. How do we protect the process? So I think I would be engaging early and broadly with everybody that needs to be involved. The other thing that came through was this idea of radical incrementalism as an idea around, like, do you inch your way forward? I wouldn't take that approach personally. This is having its moment. I suspect that for the politics of this will be wherever the line gets drawn on this is going to be put away for a while, because the whole story around the digital duty of care is that it's meant to be the kind of overarching, you don't have to do another law for every harm that comes up. It should be sort of future-proofed. I worry that if we lean too far on the only do what you know will not be that controversial or difficult, that we might not get a moment to come back to that for a while, and that it'll be kind of be put away as solved. So yeah, I think I would be saying do the work early, but be quite ambitious with what you try and achieve from a policy perspective, because it might be the main shot for a while.
Hey, Zoe, can I ask one last question that I wanted to ask a moment ago before I was really interrupted by my poor internet
technology?
Revenge of the tech.
It is. It's appropriate for this podcast. What about enforcement, though, right? So I think that the big issue that I can see with this, and lots of people can see with this, is that a digital duty of care is such a pragmatic, sensible approach to dealing with these potential harms and making tech companies take their responsibility seriously. But as ever, the issue is the companies which are often going to be responsible for the most harm and who might not take their responsibility seriously, particularly in the age of AI, right? They're either based in Silicon Valley or overseas, or if they're an open weight model, for example, they could be based from anywhere, but particularly China, and then they're downloaded in Australia. And then, like, what responsibility does the company that's created the model have? Like, how do you deal with the enforcement side of this? Because without that, doesn't this risk not being very effective? Like, how can you hold these companies to account?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that. One is, I guess, the capacity, like the forum in which they're held and the means by which they're held to account, which, you know, goes to what Lizzie was saying before about the role of the courts and the role of researcher access to data. There's the capacity of the regulator to do that. So that goes to how do we need to fund the regulators if we're going to expect this to be enforced. But to your point as well, which almost brings us full circle back to the original scope question, how do you think about the composite role of multiple different parts of the tech stack in a particular harm scenario? And that, you know, it's actually not dissimilar to your conversation earlier about the AI supply chain and the AI ecosystem and what you're getting at there, which is like there's all these different players like put next to each other. I think that's why like that makes it hard, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's the first area of law where the role of different parties in a harm has, like, pulling that apart. Like this isn't the first time that people have had to work out how to do that. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that, you know, Lizzie, what do you think? That there's presumably analogies in other spaces where there's multiple parties involved.
Yeah, like product liability, or like workplace injuries and insurance, or road accident insurance. Like there's all sorts of different ways in which you can develop schemes and stuff that involve courts, that don't involve courts,
that involve Lizzie, that don't involve
generating
Lizzie.
an insurance industry. Yeah, well, I mean, just thinking about it as well-designed rules, I think doesn't really capture the task, because there's multiple ways in which you can have a huge impact on an industry that don't involve legislative changes, but or do involve well-designed legislative changes that leverage other activities within the economy as well as other forms of power. So, you know, there's lots to be done there.
There's lots to be done in general, but I'm really glad we've got people like Zoe doing some of it and doing the hard yards, because policy is difficult. It's really easy to advocate, but to actually do it is hard. Hey, and we'll put some links to your work in the Substack this week. I think we might put a pin. I've got no idea how long this episode's gone, because we've had a few Gremlins listeners, and if I'm very good at my editing, we'll cut them out. Otherwise, I apologise for the 20 minutes of dead air when Zoe was dropping out. One way or the other, though, we'll see you next week, where I believe our guest is going to be one of the participants at your forum, the wonderful Kate Chaney. So look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thanks guys, and have a great week.